16 years ago, a small private school from Indianapolis with only about 4,500 students found their way back to their hometown into a battle with one of the blue bloods of college basketball, and they had a shot to win a game that would change college basketball history for good. But what happened? Going into the 2009-2010 season, you'd be forgiven if you didn't understand why Butler was ranked number 11 in the country in the AP preseason poll. And I think outside of the most kind of locked-in college basketball fans, it would raise question marks why that small school would be so highly ranked in the AP preseason poll, even if you paid attention to the end of the previous season, because Butler had a pretty good season. They were a ranked team going into the tournament, but they didn't win the Horizon League tournament. They ended up losing in the final against Cleveland State. They still got into the NCAA tournament as an at-large team, but they were a number 9 seed, and they ended up losing in the first round to LSU. So that doesn't really all add up to the number 11 team going into the next season. And really, it comes down to head coach Brad Stevens' first real full freshman class. And it's headlined by Gordon Hayward, who by now we all know that name. Of course, he goes on to be a star in the NBA for multiple different seasons. But even going into his sophomore season in 2009-2010, the college basketball world was starting to recognize who Gordon Hayward could be. He was a Naismith Award preseason candidate, Wooden All-American preseason candidate, multiple different preseason All-American honorable mentions and first teams and all these different things going into this season for a team that really has not had much success classically in college basketball, and of course is not even probably one of the 3 or 4 biggest schools that you think of in their own state going into this season. So that shows you how much buzz Gordon Hayward had created from his freshman season. But it's not just him. Shelvin Mack is another player that was starting to really gain some buzz, especially within the conference, but even a little bit on the national stage himself. He got preseason All-Horizon second team, and then Ronald Norad was a player that maybe didn't get the same notoriety as the top two, but definitely had showed himself in his first season and would be a key contributor through the rest of the season. All of those guys come from the same freshman class in Brad Stevens' second season. And even if the casual fans of college basketball didn't really know who Butler was, Butler knew what they had going into that season, and they scheduled like a team that was going to compete at the top levels of college basketball when it got to March Madness time. They scheduled against number 22 Minnesota, they scheduled a game against UCLA, they scheduled a game against Clemson, all part of the 76 Classic, which was just a tournament that ESPN put together over Thanksgiving weekend that year. They didn't do super great in that tournament, but they did compete against some ranked teams in the country, games that they wouldn't get in their regular conference schedule. They also got a game against number 15 Georgetown in the Jimmy V Classic, another ESPN creation. They also scheduled a game against Ohio State, which they actually won, and Ohio State ended up being even better than they were in that game later on in the season, and they actually got Ohio State to come to Hinkle Fieldhouse and play them in Indianapolis. So that was a very big get, and that lets you know what Butler was doing that season. If Ohio State would go to a 10,000-seat stadium and play a game on the road against a mid-major, they knew that Butler was a very, very good team that year. And they didn't do super great in those non-conference games, but getting those games under their belt was absolutely necessary for them to get that experience when they would play those teams later on in the season. So after losing their final non-conference game against UAB and actually dropping out of the top 25, they went on to win 18 straight games in regular season Horizon League play and go into the Horizon tournament as the number 1 seed with an undefeated record, and just needed to win 2 games to get what was probably going to be a pretty high seed going into March Madness, especially for a mid-major, and they did exactly that. They won against Milwaukee in the semifinal 68-59, and then they beat Wright State in the championship in a 1-versus-2 matchup 70-45, and earned themselves a 5 seed going into March Madness with the expectation that they would at the very least get into the second round, but be able to make some noise, because 5 seeds are not ranked there to just go in and lose. They're ranked there to go in and get a couple upsets, and spoiler alert, Butler did just that. A successful March Madness run takes execution and luck, and Butler had a lot of the first and a little bit of the second. In the first round, they faced off against fellow mid-major UTEP in the 5-12 matchup, and they put them away 77-59. And they got their first bit of what would seem to be luck in the second round when they got to face off against 13 seed Murray State as opposed to 4 seed Vanderbilt after Murray State beat Vanderbilt 66-65 in the first round. But maybe it wasn't so lucky after all, because Murray State ran Butler to the very last whistle. With just about 10 seconds to go, Murray State had a chance down 54-52 to either tie or win the game on the final possession. But Gordon Hayward actually knocked away a pass into the backcourt that ended up running out the clock, and Butler got away with the victory, 54-52, moving on to the Sweet 16, where they would face off against number 1 seed in their bracket, Syracuse, in a very, very tough matchup. This wasn't the Syracuse of a season past with Johnny Flynn and Eric Devendorf, some of the most talented players of Boeheim's run, but it was still Syracuse at the top of their 2-3, being one of the best defenses in basketball, with a bunch of athletic players around, including Wes Johnson, who had just sat out a year after transferring from Iowa State, back when you had to sit out a year when you transferred, and he was getting his first time at Syracuse. Of course, he would go on to be a future NBA player for 10 plus seasons. But even with Syracuse being the team that was billed as having the best defense, it was truly Butler's defense that came out and won the game. After Syracuse took the lead 54-50 with a little over 5:30 to go, Brad Stevens took a timeout and Butler held the team scoreless for the next 5 minutes until the very end of the game, where they hold out to win 63-59, upsetting Syracuse and moving on to their first Elite Eight in school history, facing off against Kansas State and the number 2 Wildcats. And against Kansas State, it was much of the same story. Butler went down with a little less than 5 minutes to go. Brad Stevens calls a timeout, and they go on a 12-2 run to close out the game to win the game 63-56 and move on to the Final Four, where they would match up against Michigan State. They became the smallest school in the 64-team era to advance to the Final Four. Again, they had less than 4,500 students at the time, and not only were they going to the Final Four, they were going to the Final Four back in their hometown of Indianapolis with a chance to win the entire thing. This is a story that you could not even write. This has to happen in sports. And in the second half of their Final Four game against Michigan State, they lose 2 of their biggest stars. Shelvin Mack goes down to cramping, and Matt Howard, who was Brad Stevens' kind of first signing as a head coach, one of the stars of their team, goes down with concussion-like symptoms. So they're really relying on not just Gordon Hayward, but Ronald Norrad in that second half of the game. And Norrad, like we talked about, was the kind of least talked about player in that freshman class that was really the impetus of this team, the core of this team with Hayward, Shelvin Mack, and Norrad. He came to play at the end. He actually hits the 2 free throws that iced the game, putting them up 52-49 and end up beating Michigan State 52-50 in the Final Four, and will move on to the national championship game, where they'll face off against Duke, who was far and away one of the best teams in the country. And that Duke team was littered with 4- and 5-star recruits really across the board. They had Ryan Kelly and Mason Plumlee, who had just joined, both as 6'10", 5-star freshmen. They joined Miles Plumlee, who was already there as a sophomore. He was 6'10" as well. They had Lance Thomas at 6'8", a 4-star coming in. Nolan Smith, a 4-star coming in. John Shire, a 6'5" point guard, who was a senior, had been at Duke for 4 straight seasons. And then, of course, the star of the team, the pride of Medford, Oregon, 6'8", Kyle Singler. And this team was picked to be a favorite for the NCAA tournament, for the national championship, really from the beginning of the season, and they never really let that down. They came in to the tournament as the number 3 team, and they were number 1 seed going into the national championship game against Butler, who's this tiny little team out of Indianapolis. How would they even stand a chance against these behemoths out of North Carolina? And while Butler might have been Indiana's biggest underdog, there's another underdog story out of that state from a different sport that we have to talk about, and that's the 2025 Indiana Hoosiers football team. And Indiana is one of the rare underdog stories that actually has a happy ending. I'm pretty sure that every underdog story that has a happy ending already has a Disney movie made about it. It's Glory Road, Miracle, the Air Bud franchise, and I'm sure that Omaha Productions is working with Disney to make a movie about the 2007 Giants currently. And then you got the 2025 Indiana Hoosiers. And by no mistake, Indiana is an underdog story. They're a different underdog story than Butler for sure, but an underdog story nonetheless. Because like I said, outside of a small number of people in Indianapolis and the most hardcore college basketball fans, nobody really knew about Butler leading up to the 2009-2010 season. But we knew about Indiana. They just sucked. I mean, we've all heard the stats about Indiana having the worst winning percentage in college football history leading up to the 2025 season, having the most losses in college football history leading up to the 2025 season. But this is a stat that I saw when I was looking up how bad Indiana was that really shocked me. In 125 years of Indiana football, prior to Curt Cignetti taking over in 2024, they had only been to 13 bowl games as a program. And of those 13 bowl games, they had only won 3 of them in that entire time. I mean, even if you include Curt Cignetti's first season, which they made the first round of the college football playoff and lost, they were 3-11 in bowl games prior to the 2025 season. And the last time that they won a bowl game prior to this year's Rose Bowl against Alabama was in 1991 in the Copper Bowl. Now, I'm turning 30 in a couple days here, and that's 5 years before I was born was the last time that Indiana won a bowl game that no longer even exists. That is insane. Another stat that I found out that is, again, just insane. Lee Corsley, who is this legend of college football for whatever reason, spent 10 years coaching at Indiana. Most of his college football coaching career was at Indiana from 73 to 82. During that time, he made one bowl game. It was the Holiday Bowl in 79, which they won and ended 19th in the country. That was the only time that they ended ranked during his entire 10-year run, and one of only 2 winning seasons he had in his entire run at Indiana. And he's considered a legend. So that shows you how bad Indiana was, that 1 winning season, or 2 winning seasons, and 1 bowl game, an 8-win season gets you to legendary status in Indiana college football. Just an absolute train wreck of a program that's not some underfunded little program out in the Mountain West or some little program in the Southeast that was an independent for 30 seasons or whatever it is. This is a Big Ten program in the heart of the country, a very populated and high-end university in a very populated state with a lot of big money around the area and tons of fans, a big stadium, all these kinds of things, and they could just never figure out how to win until Curt Cignetti took over in 2024. And now, in 2 seasons under Curt Cignetti, they're 37-2. Their only 2 losses during those 2 years were against the 2 teams that made it to the 2024 College Football Playoff National Championship, Notre Dame in the College Football Playoff and Ohio State during the regular season. And in this 2025 season, they have what is not only, I think, the most impressive run in college football history, but probably the best season, like as far as accomplishments, season of any team in college football history. Maybe there are better teams out there, but I do not think that there is a more accomplished team out there than the 2025 Indiana Hoosiers. And even after what they did in the 2024 season, they still came in as underdogs in 2025. I mean, in their 4th game of the season, they were in a top 20 matchup against Illinois in the Big Ten opener. They were number 19 in the country, and Illinois was number 9. Indiana won that game 63-10, letting everybody know, at the very least, we're a college football playoff team yet again this season. Then just 2 weeks later, they go on the road to Autzen at number 3 Oregon, and the only Oregon game I've been to in the past 5 or 6 seasons, and they give it to Oregon 30-20. The score looks better than the game actually was. Indiana controlled the entire game from start to finish on the offensive and defensive lines. Oregon really couldn't do anything with that. And those are kind of 2 of the strengths of Oregon. So let you know what they were working with at Indiana there. Then they had a pretty kind of easy schedule through the rest of the season. But the final 4 games of the season, the Big Ten championship game and their run in the college football playoff, is what makes that season, I think, the best run of any team in college football history. Because they beat number 1 Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game 13-10 to secure the number 1 seed going into the playoff. They then get Alabama in the Rose Bowl, which they win 38-3. Again, Alabama, 2 years removed from Nick Saban. Way, way higher high school recruit numbers, all these kinds of things that what Indiana did. And Indiana just absolutely smacked them by 5 touchdowns in the Rose Bowl. Then the next game in the Peach Bowl, they go against Oregon again, and they absolutely smack Oregon as well. 56-22. Again, one of the most frustrating games that you could possibly watch. Happened twice in the same season for Oregon fans. Let you know where we're at. Then in the national championship game, they go against Miami, who on paper is the much more talented team and probably underachieved a little bit in the regular season. But they found a way to get to the national championship game, and there they faced off against Indiana. But Miami had 2 top 5 picks, guys that have been top 5 picks since they were in high school. Like, this was their destiny. Just massive guys on the offensive and defensive line. They also got Carson Beck, who, for all his faults, is one of the most experienced college football quarterbacks. He has been at the top of college football for a long time, and he has succeeded in a lot of different ways. He goes down to Miami. He's leading that team there. They got Mario Cristobal. I mean, this was a team that was built to go win a national championship over the past 4-5 seasons under Mario Cristobal. And Indiana goes and wins that game. They go and take it away from Miami. They get the most wins in a single season in college football history, going 16-0, the only undefeated team in a regular or through the entire season in the 12-team playoff era so far, but still the only team that has done it. And they do all of that in just 2 years under Curt Cignetti. Now, there are intelligent conversations to be had about the changes in college football that allowed a team like Indiana to happen. You can talk about the smart hire of Curt Cignetti. You could talk about employing their massive alumni base to really kick up their NIL, getting Mark Cuban to donate to athletics for the first time, really understanding this change in college football. Talk about the transfer portal and how well they've done in the transfer portal versus other teams and all of these other things to kind of undercut the underdog story that is Indiana. And yes, I've been doing a lot of that mental gymnastics as well, trying to understand how the Ducks lost to this team twice in one of the most talented seasons the Ducks have ever had. But the fact of the matter is that of any team in college football to do it, it's the worst team in college football history that has figured out how to win in the modern era of college football. And that right there is an underdog story if you could ever have one. And it makes it so there was a time prior to Indiana winning a national championship, and then there was a time after Indiana winning a national championship, and that is the era that we live in today. And although, like we talked about, Butler and Indiana are two very different underdog stories, there still could have been a time before Butler won a national championship and after Butler won a national championship. And I know if you want to do the full story on Butler, you have to talk about the 2010-2011 season, where they make another probably even more improbable run through the NCAA tournament to the national championship. They face off against another team that made a very improbable run through their conference tournament and to the national championship with UConn and Kemba Walker, probably a more talented overall team than what they had played against Duke the season prior and a higher ceiling than what Duke had the season prior. They just could not compete against UConn in the same way they did against Duke, probably because they lose Gordon Hayward to the NBA. They didn't have that top-end offensive talent like they had the season prior. And through both of those runs, what Brad Stevens and Gordon Hayward and Shelvin Mack and Matt Howard and all of those guys did for Butler was changing the trajectory of that program. A college basketball program that had some success prior now is a program that went to the A-10 just a couple years after that and then quickly moved into the new Big East and is a part of one of the best college basketball conferences in the country, really because of what they did during those 2 seasons. And they've changed what Butler could do in the future. I don't know that they'll ever get back to the height that they were at during that time, but the floor is much, much higher than it was before. They're making much more money as a program, and there's a reasonable assumption that a good coach could come in and take over Butler and turn them into maybe not a perennial power, maybe they could be a perennial power, but at least a team that could make college basketball, like the NCAA tournament regularly and be one of those teams that's talked about in the top 25 and maybe even make another deep run into the tournament. Maybe Thad Matta can do that now that he's back in charge of the program after being there prior to Brad Stevens taking over. So maybe that is where Butler is going, and maybe that is the importance of this story. But what would college basketball look like if Gordon Hayward had put that shot in? From Butler's perspective, do they go from being like a good mid-major to taking over the king of mid-majors in college basketball, taking that crown away from Gonzaga and being that school that everyone kind of has a side eye on? Like, could they potentially make a run? And does Brad Stevens fight off the calls from the NBA and go the route of Mark Few, staying at this school and becoming a legend in this school's history and turning them into a program that everyone has to look at and changing their fortunes forever, more so than he already did? And from a kind of more nationwide perspective, do we start to change the way that we look at mid-majors, not just as like good stories, but as, you know, teams that have to be taken seriously each and every season to not just make a fun run, but to make a run that actually could result in a national championship each and every season? Is that where we go with college basketball? There's so many things that could have changed if this shot right here from Gordon Hayward would have went in. Thanks for watching that video. Make sure that you like and subscribe and hype the video. It helps small content creators. I'm a small content creator and I could use all the help I could get. If you made it this far, leave a comment and let me know what you think. Do you like these more story-driven videos that I'm working on here, or do you like more of the kind of conference realignment, moving things around videos? Let me know in the comments below what you think about that. And let me know what you think would have changed if that shot went in for Gordon Hayward, and what will change with Indiana being the new national champions in college football. There's a lot of new things because we live in that new world where Indiana did win. If you want to watch more videos, I do have this for you. Over here, I did my first kind of new style of video on my second channel. This is the top 5 college basketball conference tournaments for 2026. So go ahead and check that one out and subscribe to more Bucky Barracks over there. Up here, I've got a perfect Power 6 video that I did a couple weeks ago on this channel. I've also got my subscribe link on this side. If you love Bucky Barracks and want more Bucky Barracks, I've got that right up top. Other than that, we will check you next time. See ya!